Snow fell quietly over Prague. The winter the children disappeared. The kind of slow, deliberate snowfall that seemed to hush even the distant rumble of trains. From my window above the bakery on Vinohradska Street, I used to watch the orphans walk in a small line each morning, always 5 minutes before the bells of St. Ludmila began their soft ringing. They weren't really a line, not in the strict sense. More like drifting shadows that happened to move in the same direction, their coats too big, their shoes too thin, and their steps always a little hesitant, as if afraid the earth beneath them might shift while they weren't looking. One of them, a boy named Jarek, used to pause before my window as though listening. He couldn't hear, not fully. The doctor said illness had taken most of his hearing when he was very young, but he sensed vibrations, felt the world in a way most of us never bothered to. Sometimes I'd tap lightly against the glass and he'd look up, smile faintly, then hurry on as the others tugged at his sleeve. They were children without papers, without parents, without histories anyone bothered to preserve. Children whose voices had faded long before the city itself began to darken. And when they vanished, taken by forces whose names were spoken only in whispers or not at all, the silence they left behind felt heavier than the winter snow. I write now because their footsteps have long since been erased from the streets, and I fear that memory, like snow under the first warm sun, may disappear without leaving even a trace of where they once walked. Tell me, reader, when a child's voice fades into history's shadows, who is left to remember the sound? I am Marta, once a schoolteacher, now a woman who spends her days sweeping the bakery floors for my cousin and my nights trying to keep the past from slipping through my fingers. The war had already folded itself into our days by 1940, though not always in obvious ways. It showed itself in small things, the bread loaves growing thinner, the milk arriving late, the glances people exchanged before speaking. The orphanage sat only 3 blocks from my window. I taught there before the closures began, before the rules multiplied, before the lists were drawn up. The children who attended my little lessons were those who had nowhere else to go, those who relied on the soft charity of neighbors and the hard indifference of the city. Jarek was one of them. So were Mila and Thomas, brothers in everything but blood, and little Bara, whose pockets were always full of pebbles she collected from the riverbank. They trusted me in the quiet, instinctive way children do, not because I earned it, but because the world around them offered so little. I write now to speak the names that have not been spoken aloud in too many years. Before everything changed, the children's mornings followed a rhythm so fragile it felt as though a single gust of wind could scatter it. I used to arrive early, unlocking the side door of the orphanage classroom with hands stiff from the cold. The kettle would go on the stove, its soft bubbling the closest thing we had to warmth some days, and one by one, the children would slip inside. Jarek always came first. He moved quietly, his steps careful, as though every sound he made cost him something. His hearing had faded almost completely when he was 5, a fever burning away the world of birdsong and bells. But he had learned to read lips well enough, and he carried a small notebook in which he drew what he could not express aloud. The drawings were simple: a crooked tree, a circle meant to be the sun, a pair of mismatched shoes. Yet each one felt like a message from a place I could not reach. While the others settled, I often caught him placing his palm on the wooden windowsill, waiting for the streetcar to pass so he could feel its soft quake through the wall. That was the closest thing he had to hearing. When I once asked him what it felt like, he wrote only one word: alive. Then came Mila and Thomas, arriving with the clatter of mismatched boots and the smell of chimney smoke clinging to their scarves. They weren't brothers by birth. I'm not sure either knew their true origins, but they protected each other with a ferocity only the abandoned understand. Thomas was the serious one, the keeper of secrets. Mila, younger by a year, was all bright eyes and restless hands, forever folding paper into small shapes he'd leave on my desk like offerings. Little Bara arrived last. She was tiny, no more than 6, with dark hair that curled no matter how often the wardens tried to comb it flat. She walked with a small limp from an old injury no one could explain. Every morning she emptied her pockets into my hands, river pebbles smoothed by years of current. "For keeping," she'd whisper, even though she knew I would return them by the day's end. It was a ritual, hers and mine, a way of saying without words, "I see you, I remember you." The city outside grew quieter as winter deepened. The papers spoke cautiously, the streets even more so. People began lowering their voices, then lowering their eyes. But inside our classroom, life continued with the fragile persistence of candlelight. The children practiced their writing, though many letters leaned too far to one side. They traced maps of places they had never seen. They read stories of heroes they could barely imagine. And sometimes, when the day was particularly cold, we would sit close around the stove, telling memories as though they were treasures. I didn't know then that these were the last ordinary days we would share. I didn't know how quickly silence could sweep through a place, or how final it would feel. I only knew that these children, for all their hardships, still believed in morning, in the simple promise that it would come again. If I had known what waited just beyond that winter, I would have held each moment a little longer, letting their quiet laughter echo in my memory before the world grew too still to carry it. There are certain mornings that live inside me even now, moments so small and ordinary that they shouldn't have become the pillars of memory, yet somehow they have. One of them happened in late February, when the cold felt sharper, almost metallic, and the sky hung low, as if pressed down by something unseen. I arrived at the classroom before dawn, as always, my breath clouding in front of me as I unlocked the door. The kettle sputtered on the stove, struggling as though it too were tired of the winter. I set out the slates, the pencils worn down to nubs, the few books we still had. Everything in that room felt stretched thin, supplies, time, hope. But the children came anyway, their resilience stitched together with scraps of routine. Jarek entered first, his coat buttoned wrong, his cheeks pink from the wind. He looked at me, then at the frost forming delicate lines on the window glass, and he smiled in that small, private way of his. He pulled out his notebook and wrote something quickly before handing it to me. "The window sings today." I didn't fully understand, but I nodded, tracing my finger over the words as though they were fragile. The room warmed slowly as the others arrived. Mila burst in laughing at something Thomas said, though he himself remained stern-faced. He was growing older, I realized, his shoulders a little broader, his jaw more defined, and with that age came an awareness he couldn't quite explain. He watched the street too often, listened too intently to the conversations adults tried to hide. Little Bara waited until the door was nearly closed before slipping inside like a small, quiet bird, seeking warmth. She tugged at my sleeve and held out her morning treasures. 3 stones, one pale grey, one nearly white, and one streaked with a faint line of rose. That last one seemed to surprise even her. I placed them in the small wooden box I kept by my desk, where dozens of her earlier offerings rested. "I'll keep them safe," I whispered, and she nodded, relieved. That morning's lesson was geography, an impossible subject for children who had never left their own narrow streets. Yet they loved the maps, tracing coastlines with tentative fingers, imagining what it would feel like to stand somewhere far away. I let them dream, even though the world outside our window was shrinking. Midway through the lesson, the streetcar passed. The floor trembled softly, and I saw Jarek's eyes light up. He pressed his hand against the wall, closing his eyes. I watched him breathe in deeply, as though absorbing something the rest of us could not sense. In that moment, he seemed almost unburdened, but the peace did not last. A sound, a distant truck perhaps, or the city gates turning their heavy gears, made Thomas look sharply toward the window. He stood up slowly, the pencil slipping from his hand. When I approached, he whispered, "They're checking houses on the next street." His voice trembled, though he tried to steady it. The children quieted. Even little Mila, who never sat still, froze like a leaf in sudden wind. I didn't know whether Thomas's words were true or only rumor, but the fear in the room thickened like steam. I told them to continue their maps, to keep their hands busy, their minds anchored. They obeyed, but the air had shifted. Something unspoken tightened around us. Children sense danger long before adults name it. When the lesson ended, they gathered their coats slowly, eyes darting toward the frosted windows. Before leaving, Jarek touched the wall one last time, as though trying to memorize the tremble of the world before it changed again. Later that evening, I would stand at my own window and watch the street, wondering how close the shadows had come, wondering how much time we had before even routine could no longer shelter them. The days that followed moved strangely, as though time itself had begun to walk on uneven ground. The city hummed with a new kind of tension, one that didn't roar but whispered, slipping beneath doors and through the cracks of every conversation. Even the pigeons in Namnesty Miru seemed restless, lifting off in sudden bursts as if sensing something we could not. At the orphanage, the children felt it too. On the first morning of March, I arrived to find Thomas already at the gate, his hands clenched around the iron bars. He wasn't waiting for me. He was watching the street, studying the faces of the soldiers patrolling farther down the block. When I called his name, he startled, then tried to disguise his fear behind the stiff half-smile he used whenever he wanted to appear older. Inside, the classroom felt colder than it should have. The stove sputtered weakly, its flame uncertain. Mila sat with his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly, a habit he had outgrown months ago, returning now like a memory he couldn't shake off. Little Bara stayed close to my skirts, her limp more noticeable whenever she was anxious. Only Jarek seemed calm. He was tracing lines on the frost-covered window with one finger, creating shapes that dissolved almost instantly. When I touched his shoulder, he pointed toward the street, then placed his palm flat against the glass, showing me how the faint vibration traveled through it. "Trains," he mouthed, shaping the words silently. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. By mid-morning, the wardens visited the classroom, something they rarely did unless they had news they didn't want to admit aloud. Their eyes avoided mine. Their voices were thin, strained. They whispered to each other in the corner, glancing repeatedly at the children. I stepped closer. "What is it?" I asked. One of them, an older woman with trembling hands, finally answered. "There are new lists, new regulations. Some children may need to be transferred." The word transferred hung between us like a cracked bell. It meant nothing and everything. It meant they would be moved, relocated, sent somewhere no one could name. "Which children?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Or perhaps she couldn't. That afternoon, the children sensed the change in the adults' voices, the way conversations stopped when they entered the room. Fear is contagious. It passes from grown-ups to children not through words, but through the way hands grip doorknobs too tightly, or how smiles flicker instead of settling. When the lesson ended, I lingered with them longer than usual. We read a story, a simple one about a fox lost in a forest and the lantern that guided her home. The children listened in silence, each holding the tale differently. Mila leaned into Thomas, and even the older boy did not pull away. Little Bara pressed her warm hand into mine. As they put on their coats, Jarek handed me a page from his notebook. A single drawing filled the center, 5 small figures standing in a line, each holding a pebble. Above them, he had written in uneven letters, "We stay together." I wanted to believe those words. I wanted to anchor myself in the possibility that childhood bonds could resist whatever marched toward us. But the world outside had begun erasing lines faster than we could draw them. That evening, as I walked home, the street was darker than usual. A truck passed slowly, its engine low and deliberate. I watched it turn the corner and felt something slip, a thread loosening in the fabric of the days we had fought so quietly to protect. The last morning I saw the children began like any other, with frost on the eaves, footsteps on the cobblestones, and the faint hope that routine might hold the world steady a little longer. But hope, I have learned, is a fragile thing in wartime. It bends easily, it tears without warning. I reached the orphanage early, unlocking the classroom door and setting the kettle to boil the way I always did. I waited for their familiar footsteps, for the soft knock from Mila, the quiet shuffle of Tomas, the tiny patter of Bara, the gentle presence of Jarek. But none of them came. Minutes stretched into hours, each second a tightening thread. I went to the main hall, calling their names softly, then louder. The warden's office was empty, papers scattered as though abandoned in haste. A single boot print marred the dust near the supply room. I stepped outside. The street was silent, unnaturally so. People stood in doorways, not speaking. A neighbor shook her head slowly when I approached, tears clinging to her lashes. "They came early," she whispered, "before sunrise." I knew who she meant. Everyone did. I walked the 3 blocks to my apartment without feeling the ground beneath me. The city sounded distant, muffled. When I reached my window overlooking Vinohradska Street, I pressed my palm against the cold glass, the way Jarek once had. But no vibration came, only a deep, hollow stillness. For days afterward, I searched. I went to the wardens, the churches, the stations. Everywhere I heard the same words. No records, no information, no list of names. Children without papers leave no trail, they said. They vanish as easily as breath in winter air, but memory does not vanish. Weeks later, when the frost began to melt, a small parcel appeared outside my door. No marks, no signature. Inside was a wooden box I recognized instantly, the one where I had kept Bara's pebbles. It was empty except for a single stone, the pale one streaked with rose. I held it tightly in my palm. War erases many things, but not all. Some fragments survive, carried by unseen hands, by chance, by love, by the stubborn refusal of memory to quiet itself. Even now, decades later, when I walk along the riverbank, I find myself searching among the stones. Not for closure, that word feels too final, but for a whisper, a trace, a reminder that once, on quiet winter mornings, 5 children crossed my threshold and filled a cold room with warmth. Their voices were small, but they were never lost to me. Dear reader, stories like theirs do not end. They simply settle into the soft corners of history, waiting for someone willing to listen. I write so the silence does not deepen, so their footsteps echo just a little longer, so the pebbles a child once gathered remain held in gentle hands. If this memory found a home in you even briefly, let it stay. Let it remind you how easily a voice can vanish, and how important it is that someone remembers. And if you feel moved, dear reader, I invite you softly to like and subscribe, so these forgotten stories may continue to be heard in the quiet places where echoes still live.